Billionaire's daughter. Jokes about marriage. What a mechanic did left everyone in tears. Witness this unbelievable, true inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. Victoria Sterling had everything money could buy, yet she often felt like she had nothing of true value. At just 24 years old, she was the only daughter of Robert Sterling, a tech billionaire whose name was known in every financial magazine and business journal. Sterling Industries was a global empire, producing software, electronics, and even aerospace technology. From birth, Victoria had lived in penthouses, private estates, and luxury hotels. Her life sparkled on the surface, but deep down, it was marked by a strange emptiness that not even designer dresses or exotic vacations could fill. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, fate decided to intervene. Driving her Ferrari along the winding roads outside Millbrook, a small town tucked away in New York State, Victoria's car sputtered and came to a sudden halt. She tried restarting it, but the engine refused to turn over. Frustrated, she glanced at her phone, only to realize she had no signal. The sky grew darker, raindrops streaking down the sleek windshield as she sat stranded by the roadside. With a sigh, she stepped out into the drizzle, her designer heels clicking against the wet pavement. She hated the idea of walking in the rain, but there was no other choice. After nearly 20 minutes of trudging along, she spotted a weathered auto shop with a faded sign that read, "Eddie's Garage." Relief washed over her as she pushed open the creaky door. Inside, the scent of motor oil and old leather filled the air. A radio played softly in the background, and beneath an old pickup truck, a pair of worn boots stuck out. A young man in oil-stained overalls slid out on a creeper, wiping his hands on a rag. His hair was dark, his skin tanned from hours spent working outdoors, and his kind brown eyes caught Victoria off guard. "Hi," he said warmly, flashing a genuine smile that contrasted the gloom outside. "I'm Eddie Martinez. How can I help you?" "My car broke down," Victoria replied, trying to sound casual. "It's a Ferrari." She said the word as if it should impress him, as it usually did in her world. But Eddie only shrugged. "Well, cars are cars. Let me take a look." The simplicity of his response startled her. Most people would have reacted with awe, curiosity, or envy, but Eddie treated it as if she had just mentioned a Toyota. Together they walked out to the Ferrari, rain dripping from the edges of the garage roof. As Eddie bent over the engine, Victoria found herself answering his small questions. "So what do you do?" he asked, checking the spark plugs. "I, help run my family's business," she lied quickly. She couldn't bring herself to say she was the daughter of Robert Sterling, not yet. Not when she was finally talking to someone who looked at her without preconceived notions. "That's good," Eddie said. "Family businesses are special. My dad started this garage 40 years ago. I learned everything from him before he passed away last year." His voice softened, and for a moment Victoria saw something in his eyes, grief, but also pride. "I'm sorry about your father," she whispered. "Thanks," he said, giving a small nod. "He always told me to treat every customer's problem like it's the most important thing in the world, whether it's a Ferrari or a beat-up Honda." Victoria stood silently as Eddie worked. For 2 hours, he explained each step patiently, his hands moving with a practiced ease. Despite her wealth, no one had ever taken the time to explain such things to her before. It was strangely comforting. When the Ferrari finally roared back to life, Eddie handed her a small slip of paper. "That'll be $43. Just for the parts. Don't worry about the labor. Consider it my welcome to Millbrook gift." Victoria was stunned. In her world, people charge premium prices simply because her last name was Sterling. She reached for her wallet, trying to hand him extra, but he shook his head firmly. No need. Honest work deserves an honest price. Almost without thinking, Victoria asked, "Would you like to get coffee?" A few minutes later, they sat across from each other in the local diner, the neon lights reflecting off rain-streaked windows. The coffee was cheap but hot, and the pie was homemade. To her surprise, Victoria found herself talking naturally with Eddie, laughing, listening, sharing little pieces of her life she had never told anyone else. Eddie spoke of his dream to expand the garage, to bring in new equipment, and maybe even start an apprenticeship program for local kids who needed direction. He confessed that he was struggling financially, but never let it dampen his optimism. Victoria, in turn, admitted to feelings of loneliness, though she kept her identity hidden under the safe guise of working for a small consulting firm. "You seem different," Eddie told her with a sincere expression. "Like you understand what it means to work for something. Most people I meet, they don't get it." Over the next 3 months, their connection grew deeper. Every weekend, Victoria returned to Millbrook. Sometimes they went to the movies. Sometimes they just walked by the lake, eating ice cream and talking until the stars came out. With Eddie, she felt free, unburdened by her father's empire and the constant expectations of her social circle. One cool evening by the lake, Eddie took her hands. His voice was low but steady. "Victoria, I've never felt this way about anyone. I love you. I know I don't have much compared to city guys, but—" She silenced him with a kiss, her heart pounding. "You have everything that matters." Yet even as she said it, the weight of her lies pressed heavily on her chest. Each time Eddie mentioned his struggles, saving for rent, paying off bills, she knew she could solve it all with pocket change. But she also knew that revealing her truth might shatter the fragile, beautiful trust between them. That fragile peace ended one December morning when her father's sleek black limousine pulled up to the garage. A chauffeur stepped out and called, "Miss Sterling, your father needs you for an emergency board meeting." Eddie froze, his wrench clattering to the ground. Sterling, like Sterling Industries? "Yes, sir," the chauffeur replied. "Miss Victoria Sterling, daughter of Robert Sterling." The air thickened with silence. Eddie's expression darkened as the truth dawned. "You're—" His voice broke. "You're a billionaire's daughter." "Eddie, I can explain." "But—" He stepped back, shaking his head. "I need to think. Please just go." For 2 weeks, Eddie ignored her calls and messages. When Victoria finally returned to Millbrook, she was heartbroken to find the garage closed, a "For Rent" sign nailed to the door. She later learned Eddie had been drowning in medical debts from his father's illness and could no longer keep up with rising rent. Too proud to ask for help, he had taken a temporary job in Albany and was preparing to leave town. Victoria felt her world spinning. For the first time, she understood what it meant to lose something that truly mattered. Not a car, not a luxury, but a person who had touched her soul. She drove to Eddie's father's old house, where she found him packing boxes into a borrowed truck. His shoulders slumped, his once confident posture replaced by weary defeat. "Eddie, please just listen to me," she begged. He didn't look at her. "What's to explain, Victoria? You're a billionaire's daughter slumming with the poor. Mechanic. Was it entertaining?" "That's not fair, and you know it." He turned sharply, his eyes filled with hurt. "You lied about everything, your job, your life, your family. How do I know anything was real?" Tears streamed down her cheeks. "My feelings for you were real. They're the most real thing in my life." "Then why didn't you trust me with the truth?" "Because I was terrified," she admitted. "Everyone treats me differently when they know who I am. With you, I was just me. For once in my life, someone saw me, not my father's name." But that wasn't really you, was it? Eddie whispered. That was a character you played. Her voice trembled. You want the truth? Yes, I'm rich. Yes, I grew up with everything handed to me. But I've never worked for something I truly wanted until I met you. I've never cared about anyone the way I care about you. What we had, it was real. Eddie stood in silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Finally he shook his head. How can I trust that? Victoria wiped her tears, her jaw firming with determination. Because I'm going to prove it to you. Victoria had always been surrounded by power, money, and privilege, but never had she felt more helpless than in that moment, standing in front of Eddie as he packed away his father's belongings into boxes. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the quiet defeat that came when someone had carried the weight of the world for too long without relief. This wasn't the proud, hopeful man she had first met in that small garage. This was a man who had been betrayed, who was trying to armor his heart against more disappointment. And she knew she had been the one to put that pain there. Eddie, please listen to me, she said again, her voice trembling with desperation. He didn't turn to look at her. His hands kept working mechanically, taping up a cardboard box. What's left to say? You're a sterling, a billionaire's daughter, and I'm just some guy who fixes cars in a forgotten town. It was a game to you, wasn't it? A little escape before you went back to your world. Her heart broke at his words. No, that's not fair, Eddie. And you know it. He finally spun around, anger and hurt flashing in his eyes. You lied to me about everything, your job, your life, your family. How can I believe anything we shared was real? Every laugh, every kiss, every late-night talk by the lake, was that Victoria Sterling or the character you pretended to be? Tears blurred her vision as she stepped closer. My feelings for you were real. They are the most real thing I've ever had in my life. You think it was easy to hide who I was? It killed me every time you talked about your struggles, every time you mentioned the rent or the bills, and I sat there knowing I could fix it all but terrified that if I told you, you'd never look at me the same way again. His voice softened, but it carried the weight of disappointment. And you were right, because now I don't know who I was falling in love with, the woman in front of me or the lie she created. Her voice cracked with emotion. You want the truth? Here it is. Yes, I'm rich. Yes, I've had everything handed to me my entire life. But none of that has ever mattered. Not once. All those mansions and parties and expensive clothes, they never made me feel alive. You did. For the first time, I wanted something for myself, something that wasn't tied to my father's empire. I wanted you. I wanted us. What we had, it wasn't fake, Eddie. It was the only thing in my life that was real. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the sound of rain pattering on the roof of the old house. Eddie's jaw clenched, his eyes torn between longing and mistrust. How can I trust that? He whispered. Victoria drew in a shaky breath and wiped at her tears. Then her voice steadied with a strength he had never seen in her before. Because I'm going to prove it to you. The next morning, Millbrook woke to something extraordinary. Trucks rolled into town carrying lumber, tools, and supplies. Contractors set up scaffolding around the shuttered garage, and in the middle of it all stood Victoria Sterling, not in designer clothes, not in heels, but in jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt. She was carrying clipboards, speaking with townspeople, and lifting boxes as though she had been born to it. People whispered, in shock, others gawked in disbelief. Nobody could understand why the billionaire's daughter was on Main Street working like one of them. At first, some suspected it was charity or a publicity stunt, but when Victoria began knocking on doors and meeting business owners, the truth came out. She had spent sleepless nights researching every struggling corner of Millbrook, the family-owned diner that couldn't afford new kitchen equipment, the little bookstore that was months away from closing, the small farm barely clinging on against debt, even the elementary school that had leaks in the roof and needed urgent repairs. She had created something she called the Miguel Martinez Memorial Foundation for Small-Town Dreams, named not after herself, but after Eddie's late father. The foundation would offer interest-free loans to struggling local businesses, fund community projects, and even establish a trade school where Eddie would be invited to run the automotive program, teaching the next generation of mechanics. But the detail that stunned everyone the most was how she structured it. Victoria refused to keep control of the foundation. After the initial funding, the town would elect its own board of directors. She would not be the savior of Millbrook, but a partner. When Eddie stepped out of his father's house and saw the commotion, his breath caught. He watched in silence as she coordinated with contractors, laughed with children, and worked alongside townsfolk like she had belonged there. Her whole life, it wasn't charity, it was something deeper, something humbler. Finally, Victoria noticed him standing there. She walked over slowly, her eyes vulnerable but determined. "I'm not trying to buy you, Eddie," she said softly. "I'm trying to show you what you taught me. You taught me what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself. You taught me that every person matters, that every problem matters because it matters to someone. I can't change the fact that I lied, but I can show you who I really am when I'm not hiding." Eddie's throat tightened. "Why name it after? My father?" "Because he raised a son who treats people with dignity," she answered without hesitation. "Because he taught you to care about others in a way that changed me forever. I wanted his name to stand for hope in this town, the way he was hope for you." Tears welled in Eddie's eyes, but before he could respond, Victoria reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small box and opened it to reveal a simple, modest ring from the local jeweler. Gasps rippled through the growing crowd that had gathered around them. "I know traditionally the man proposes," she said with a nervous laugh, "but I've never been very traditional. Eddie Martinez, you are the most special person I've ever known. You make me want to earn the love you give so freely. I don't want to hide anymore. I don't want to pretend. I just want you. Will you marry me? Not the billionaire's daughter, but me, the woman who learned what love really means because of a broken Ferrari and a mechanic who treats every problem like it's the most important thing in the world." The crowd held its breath. Mrs. Jen from the diner was openly crying, clutching a napkin to her face. The mailman had stopped in the middle of his route, his bag hanging from his shoulder. Even the construction workers wiped at their eyes, pretending it was dust. Eddie stared. At the ring, then at Victoria's tear-streaked face, then at the foundation already being built in his father's name. He saw the hope in the townspeople's eyes, the quiet belief that maybe something good was finally happening to Millbrook. His heart swelled with emotions he could barely contain. "Victoria Sterling," he said at last, his voice breaking. "I fell in love with you when I thought you were nobody special. Turns out you're somebody extraordinary, but not for the reasons the world thinks." He reached out, took the ring, and slid it onto his finger. Yes, I'll marry you. But on one condition, whatever we do as equal partners. In everything." Relief and joy flooded Victoria's face as she nodded through her tears. "Equal partners," she whispered. Then she laughed and threw her arms around him as the town erupted in cheers. The weeks that followed transformed Millbrook. The foundation began its work, repairing the school, funding the diner, saving the bookstore, and offering opportunities to families who had long given up hope. Eddie reopened the garage, but this time it was also a classroom. Young men and women from across the county came to learn under his guidance, their lives changed by his patience and dedication. Victoria taught business skills at the new trade school, discovering a talent for mentoring young entrepreneurs. 5 years later, Millbrook had blossomed into a thriving community. Where once there had been boarded-up shops and despair, There were now bustling storefronts and smiling faces. The foundation, now entirely run by the town's elected board, stood as a symbol of what could happen when people believed in one another. And at the center of it all were Eddie and Victoria, not as savior and mechanic, not as billionaire's daughter and small-town dreamer, but as equal partners building a life together. They lived in a modest house Eddie had renovated himself, not because they couldn't afford more, but because it felt like home. They filled it with laughter, late-night talks, and the smell of Eddie's mother's recipes passed down through the years. They celebrated victories with their community and mourned losses together. They were no longer divided by class or money, but united by something stronger. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Eddie surprised Victoria by taking her back to the very spot where her Ferrari had broken down years ago. The road was quieter now, the rain absent, but the memories were vivid. "I never told you this," Eddie said with a mischievous grin. "But your car that day, it only needed 20 minutes of work. I fixed it immediately." Victoria blinked in shock. "What? Then why did you spend 2 hours under the hood?" Eddie chuckled. "Because you were the most interesting person who had ever walked into my garage, and I wanted an excuse to keep talking to you." Her jaw dropped before laughter bubbled out, tears filling her eyes. "You mean to tell me you sabotaged my time just to be with me?" "No," Eddie corrected, gently pulling her close. "I just recognized something special, and I didn't want to let it drive away."